The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy grounds as Sarah Martinez adjusted her freshly pressed uniform for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the fabric, checking every crease and button. Today marked her first day as a newly commissioned naval officer, and, despite years of rigorous training, her stomach churned with nervous energy. Sarah had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother deploy overseas. The crisp white uniform represented everything she had worked toward: respect, honor, and the chance to serve her country. But, as she walked across the courtyard toward the administrative building, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about how people looked at her. At 24, Sarah was petite and soft-spoken, traits that had often made her the target of doubt throughout her academy years. While her male classmates seemed to command attention effortlessly, she had to work twice as hard to prove herself worthy of the same respect. Her academic records were spotless, her physical fitness scores exceeded requirements, and her leadership evaluations ranked in the top 5% of her class. Yet somehow, she still felt like she was fighting an uphill battle for acceptance. The administrative building buzzed with activity as various officers moved through the corridors with purpose and confidence. Sarah approached the reception desk where a stern-looking sergeant sat behind a computer screen. The nameplate read Sergeant Williams, and when he looked up, his expression remained neutral but professional. "Lieutenant Martinez reporting for assignment processing," Sarah announced, presenting her orders with practiced precision. Sergeant Williams reviewed her paperwork with methodical care, occasionally glancing up at her with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched uncomfortably long as he cross-referenced information on his computer. Other officers came and went during this process, some receiving quick acknowledgments and immediate directions to their next destination. "Everything appears to be in order, Lieutenant," the sergeant finally said, handing back her documents. "Colonel Harrison will conduct your final interview. Third floor, room 312. He's expecting you at 0900 hours. Sarah checked her watch, 15 minutes to spare. She thanked the sergeant and made her way to the elevator, using the brief ride to center herself mentally. Colonel Harrison had a reputation throughout the academy as a tough but fair officer who had served multiple combat deployments. Meeting with him represented the final step before receiving her permanent assignment, and she was determined to make a strong first impression. The third-floor corridor seemed longer than it actually was as Sarah walked toward room 312. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, and she passed several offices where officers worked quietly at their desks. The atmosphere felt serious and professional, exactly what she expected from a military facility, but she couldn't help noticing that most of the faces she saw were male. When she reached Colonel Harrison's office, the door stood slightly ajar. She could hear voices inside, the colonel speaking with someone else about deployment schedules and personnel assignments. Sarah waited respectfully outside until she heard a pause in the conversation, then knocked firmly on the doorframe. "Enter," came a gruff voice from inside. Sarah stepped into the office and immediately snapped to attention. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez reporting as ordered, sir." Colonel Harrison sat behind an imposing oak desk covered with stacks of files and military documentation. He was a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent in challenging environments. His uniform was immaculate, and numerous ribbons and medals adorned his chest, each representing significant accomplishments and service milestones. Standing near the window was another officer, a Navy SEAL lieutenant whose presence commanded immediate respect. His uniform bore the distinctive trident pin that marked him as one of the elite Special Operations Forces. The SEAL appeared to be in his early 30s, with an athletic build and alert eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. Sarah noticed his nameplate read Lieutenant Davis, as she maintained a rigid posture. "At ease, Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Harrison said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the chairs facing his desk. "Lieutenant Davis and I were just discussing upcoming deployment rotations. Your timing is actually quite convenient." Sarah sat down carefully, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She glanced briefly at Lieutenant Davis, who had taken a position leaning against the wall where he could observe the entire room. His expression remained neutral, but she sensed he was evaluating her just as much as the colonel was. Colonel Harrison opened a thick file folder and began reviewing its contents with deliberate slowness. The silence in the room grew heavy as he turned pages and made occasional marks with his pen. Sarah fought the urge to fidget or speak, knowing that patience and composure were being tested just as much as her qualifications. "Your academic record is impressive, Lieutenant," the colonel finally said, looking up from the file. "Top of your class in navigation and communications, excellent marks in strategic planning, and your instructors speak highly of your analytical abilities." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, allowing herself a moment of cautious optimism. However, the colonel continued, his tone becoming more skeptical. "There's a significant difference between classroom theory and real-world application. Military service isn't an academic exercise, and combat situations don't follow textbook scenarios." Sarah felt her confidence wavering slightly, but maintained her professional demeanor. "I understand that, sir. I'm eager to learn from experienced officers and prove myself in practical situations." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that seemed to contain doubt mixed with something approaching condescension. "The thing is, Lieutenant, military service requires a certain level of physical and mental toughness that not everyone possesses. It's not just about passing tests or memorizing procedures. It's about life and death decisions made under extreme pressure." The implication in his words was clear, and Sarah felt a familiar sting of discrimination that she had encountered too many times during her training. She had heard similar comments from various sources, subtle suggestions that her gender made her less capable of handling the demands of military service, despite her proven track record of excellence. "I believe my training record demonstrates my capability in high-stress situations, sir," Sarah responded carefully. "I've completed all required simulations and exercises with scores that meet or exceed standards." "Simulations," the colonel repeated with obvious skepticism. "That's exactly my point, Lieutenant. When you're in a forward operating base under enemy fire, or when you're responsible for the lives of dozens of personnel in a crisis situation, there's no reset button. There's no instructor standing by to offer guidance. There's just you, your training, and your ability to make critical decisions under pressure." Lieutenant Davis remained silent during this exchange, but Sarah noticed his attention had sharpened. His posture suggested he was listening carefully to every word, though his expression gave no indication of his thoughts on the conversation. Colonel Harrison stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where groups of cadets were conducting training exercises. "I've been in this military for 28 years, Lieutenant Martinez. I've served in 3 combat zones and commanded units ranging from small tactical teams to full battalions. In my experience, certain individuals are naturally suited for military leadership, while others struggle to adapt to the realities of service life." The colonel's words felt like a direct challenge to everything Sarah had worked to achieve. She knew he was questioning her suitability for military service based on assumptions about her capabilities rather than her actual performance. The unfairness of the situation made her angry, but she also knew that any display of emotion would only reinforce his negative perceptions. "Sir, I respectfully disagree with any assessment based on assumptions rather than demonstrated performance," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Every evaluation I've received has indicated that I possess the skills and temperament necessary for effective military service." Colonel Harrison turned back from the window with an expression that suggested he found her response amusing rather than compelling. "Lieutenant, you're 24 years old with no real-world military experience beyond academy training. You've never been deployed, never faced actual enemy fire, never had to make decisions that could result in casualties if you get them wrong. Your uniform is spotless and your boots are shined, but that doesn't necessarily translate to effective leadership under combat conditions." The dismissive tone in his voice was unmistakable now. Sarah realized that this interview had become less about evaluating her qualifications and more about the colonel expressing his personal doubts about women in military service. She had encountered this attitude before, but never so blatantly from a senior officer during an official evaluation. "I understand that experience is valuable, sir," Sarah replied, working to keep her voice level. "However, every officer begins their career without combat experience. The purpose of military training is to prepare officers for those situations, and I believe I've demonstrated my readiness through consistent high performance in all required areas. Colonel Harrison returned to his desk and picked up her file again, flipping through it with theatrical deliberation. Your instructors do speak positively about your work ethic and attention to detail. Those are certainly valuable qualities. However, I have concerns about whether you have the natural authority and presence that effective military leadership requires. Lieutenant Davis shifted slightly in his position against the wall, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what might have been disapproval crossing his features. She couldn't tell if his reaction was directed at her or at the colonel's comments, but she sensed a change in the room's atmosphere. Perhaps we should discuss specific assignment options. The colonel continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, but still carrying an undertone of condescension. Given your academic strengths, you might be well suited for administrative or support roles where attention to detail and organizational skills are paramount. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized where this conversation was heading. Administrative and support roles were important to military operations, but they weren't the leadership positions she had trained for and dreamed of pursuing. The colonel was essentially suggesting that despite her excellent training record, she should be relegated to desk work rather than given opportunities for real military leadership. Sir, my goal is to serve in operational roles where I can utilize my training in strategic planning and tactical leadership, Sarah said, fighting to keep disappointment out of her voice. I believe I'm qualified for assignments that involve direct responsibility for personnel and mission execution. The colonel's smile was patronizing as he closed her file and set it aside. Lieutenant, ambition is admirable, but it's important to have realistic expectations about your capabilities and limitations. The military isn't a place for learning through trial and error when lives are at stake. Perhaps after you've gained some practical experience in supportive roles, we can revisit the possibility of more challenging assignments. The meeting was clearly moving toward a conclusion that would limit Sarah's career prospects based on the colonel's preconceived notions rather than her actual qualifications. She felt a mixture of anger and frustration, but also a determination not to accept this dismissive treatment without making her position clear. Colonel Harrison, I respectfully request that assignment decisions be based on my training record and demonstrated capabilities rather than assumptions about my potential performance, Sarah said, her voice carrying quiet strength. I've met every standard required for commissioned officers and believe I deserve the same opportunities as my peers. The colonel's expression hardened slightly at what he apparently perceived as insubordination. Lieutenant Martinez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but enthusiasm alone doesn't qualify someone for combat leadership roles. The military requires officers who can command respect and make tough decisions under pressure. These qualities can't be taught in a classroom or measured by test scores. Lieutenant Davis had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Sarah noticed his attention was completely focused on the conversation now. His posture suggested alertness and possibly growing concern about the direction the meeting was taking. She wondered what his perspective was on the colonel's comments and whether he agreed with the assessment being presented. I understand the importance of practical leadership skills, sir, Sarah responded. However, I believe the proper way to develop and demonstrate those skills is through appropriate assignments and mentorship, not through exclusion from opportunities based on untested assumptions. Colonel Harrison stood up again, signaling that the meeting was nearing its end. Lieutenant, I've made my assessment based on extensive experience with military personnel. While your academic achievements are commendable, I have serious doubts about your readiness for operational assignments. My recommendation will be for placement in administrative roles where you can contribute effectively while gaining necessary experience. The finality in his tone made it clear that he considered the matter settled. Sarah felt a crushing disappointment as she realized that months of preparation and years of excellent performance were being dismissed by one man's prejudiced assumptions. She had worked too hard and come too far to accept this outcome without a fight, but she also knew that challenging a superior officer's decision could have serious consequences for her career. Sir, I would like to formally request reconsideration of this assessment, Sarah said, maintaining her professional composure despite the emotional turmoil she felt. I believe my qualifications warrant assignment to positions that will allow me to utilize my training and demonstrate my capabilities. The colonel's response was immediate and dismissive. Lieutenant Martinez, your request is noted but denied. My assessment stands, and my recommendations will be forwarded accordingly. You're dismissed." Sarah stood up and saluted properly, though every instinct told her to continue arguing her case. The injustice of the situation burned in her chest, but she knew that further protest would only reinforce the colonel's negative perceptions. As she prepared to leave, she glanced once more at Lieutenant Davis, whose expression had become increasingly thoughtful during the latter part of the conversation. "Thank you for your time, sir," Sarah said formally, though the words felt hollow. She turned toward the door, her mind already racing ahead to possible next steps and appeals processes that might allow her to challenge this unfair assessment. As she reached for the door handle, Lieutenant Davis spoke for the first time since she had entered the room. "Colonel Harrison, if I may interject for a moment." Both Sarah and the colonel turned toward the SEAL officer with surprise. Lieutenant Davis stepped away from the wall and moved closer to the desk, his bearing confident and respectful, but clearly indicating he had something important to say. Lieutenant Davis moved forward with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to speaking in high-stakes situations. His sudden entry into the conversation caught both Sarah and Colonel Harrison off guard, and the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Sarah found herself holding her breath, uncertain whether this development would help or hurt her already deteriorating situation. "Colonel, I hope you don't mind me offering some perspective on this matter," Lieutenant Davis said, his tone respectful but carrying an underlying authority that came from years of elite military service. "I've been observing this evaluation, and I have some concerns about the assessment criteria being applied." Colonel Harrison's expression showed surprise, mixed with irritation at having his judgment questioned, particularly in front of the officer he had just dismissed. "Lieutenant Davis, I appreciate your input, but this evaluation has been conducted according to standard protocols. My assessment is based on extensive experience with personnel assignments." "Sir, I don't question your experience," Lieutenant Davis replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while clearly indicating he disagreed with the colonel's conclusions. "However, I've spent the last 8 years working with officers from all branches of the military in various operational contexts. In my experience, the qualities that make an effective military leader aren't always immediately obvious, and they certainly aren't determined by assumptions about an individual's background or appearance." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. She had expected to leave the office defeated and facing an uncertain future, but now a respected special operations officer was essentially challenging the colonel's assessment on her behalf. She wasn't sure what had motivated Lieutenant Davis to intervene, but she felt a spark of hope that perhaps this situation wasn't as hopeless as it had seemed moments before. "Lieutenant Davis, while I value your perspective, I'm confident in my ability to assess officer potential," Colonel Harrison said, his tone becoming more defensive. "This evaluation has been thorough and fair, based on established criteria for military leadership readiness." "Colonel, with respect, I didn't observe any assessment of Lieutenant Martinez's actual capabilities," Lieutenant Davis responded, his voice remaining calm but becoming more direct. "What I heard was a series of assumptions about her potential performance based on her appearance and gender, rather than any evaluation of her demonstrated skills or leadership qualities." The room fell silent as the implications of Lieutenant Davis's statement hung in the air. Sarah realized that the SEAL officer was directly challenging the legitimacy of the colonel's assessment process, essentially accusing him of discrimination. This was a serious allegation that could have significant consequences for everyone involved, and she wondered if Lieutenant Davis fully understood the risks he was taking by speaking up. Colonel Harrison's face flushed with anger at having his professional judgment questioned so directly. "Lieutenant Davis, I think you're overstepping your bounds here. My assessment methods are well established and have been effective throughout my career. I don't appreciate having my judgment questioned based on your limited observation of this process." "Sir, I'm not questioning your overall judgment or experience," Lieutenant Davis replied, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "However, as an officer who has worked extensively in joint operations, I feel obligated to speak up when I observe evaluation processes that don't align with military standards for fair and objective assessment." Sarah found herself caught between admiration for Lieutenant Davis's courage and concern about the potential consequences of this confrontation. She knew that challenging a superior officer's decisions was risky business, especially for someone outside the immediate chain of command. Yet she couldn't help but feel grateful that someone was finally, addressing the obvious bias she had encountered throughout the evaluation process. Lieutenant Martinez demonstrated clear competence in her responses, and, bearing during this meeting, Lieutenant Davis continued, addressing the specific issues at hand. Her training record speaks for itself, and her academic achievements indicate someone with the analytical abilities essential for effective military leadership. I see no objective basis for questioning her readiness for operational assignments. Colonel Harrison stood up abruptly, his anger becoming more apparent. Lieutenant Davis, you're speaking about matters outside your area of responsibility. Personnel assignments for this command are my decision to make based on my assessment of individual qualifications and readiness. Colonel, you're absolutely correct that personnel assignments are your responsibility, Lieutenant Davis acknowledged. However, when those assignments are based on discriminatory practices rather than objective evaluation, it becomes a matter that affects military readiness and effectiveness overall. The accusation was now explicit, and Sarah watched as Colonel Harrison's expression shifted from anger to something approaching alarm. Allegations of discrimination in military personnel decisions were serious matters that could trigger investigations and potentially damage careers. Lieutenant Davis was essentially forcing the colonel to either defend his assessment based on objective criteria or acknowledge that his decision was influenced by inappropriate factors. I resent the implication that my assessment was anything other than professional and objective, Colonel Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I've been evaluating officer potential for over 2 decades, and my recommendations have consistently resulted in successful placements and career development. Sir, I'm sure that's true in many cases, Lieutenant Davis replied diplomatically. However, in this specific instance, I heard no discussion of Lieutenant Martinez's actual qualifications, leadership potential, or demonstrated capabilities. Instead, I heard generalized statements about physical and mental toughness that seemed to presuppose inadequacy based on her gender rather than her individual merits. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement and anxiety. Lieutenant Davis was essentially putting his own career at risk to defend her right to fair treatment, and she couldn't understand what had motivated him to take such a stand. They had never met before this morning, and he had no personal investment in her career prospects. Yet here he was, challenging a senior officer's discriminatory behavior with a courage that she found both inspiring and humbling. Colonel Harrison moved around his desk to face Lieutenant Davis directly, his posture becoming more confrontational. Lieutenant, I think you're making assumptions about my motivations that are both unfair and inaccurate. My concerns about Lieutenant Martinez's readiness are based on legitimate questions about her experience level and leadership presence, not on any bias regarding her gender. Colonel, if that's the case, then perhaps we could discuss specific examples of how Lieutenant Martinez's responses or bearing during this meeting demonstrated inadequate leadership presence, Lieutenant Davis suggested. Or we could review specific aspects of her training record that indicate insufficient preparation for operational assignments. The challenge was direct and impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Davis was essentially demanding that Colonel Harrison justify his negative assessment with concrete evidence rather than vague generalizations. Sarah realized that the SEAL officer had cleverly maneuvered the conversation to a point where the colonel would have to either provide legitimate justification for his decision or admit that his assessment was based on inappropriate factors. Colonel Harrison hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling to find specific examples to support his negative evaluation. Rather than making accusations or expressing outrage, he was systematically dismantling the colonel's justifications by demanding specific evidence for his conclusions. This methodical approach was forcing Colonel Harrison to confront the reality that his assessment was based on prejudice rather than objective evaluation. It's not always possible to quantify these qualities, Colonel Harrison said, his defensiveness becoming more apparent. Military leadership involves intangible factors that experienced officers can recognize even when they're difficult to articulate specifically. Colonel, I understand that leadership involves intangible qualities, Lieutenant Davis acknowledged. However, military evaluation procedures require that assessment decisions be based on observable behaviors and demonstrated capabilities rather than subjective impressions that might be influenced by unconscious bias. The conversation had reached a critical point where Colonel Harrison could no longer avoid acknowledging the fundamental problem with his assessment. Lieutenant Davis had systematically eliminated all the colonel's justifications, leaving him with no choice but to admit that his negative evaluation was based on discriminatory assumptions rather than legitimate professional concerns. Lieutenant Davis, I think this conversation has gone beyond what's appropriate or necessary, Colonel Harrison said, attempting to regain control of the situation. My assessment stands, and I expect my decisions to be respected rather than questioned by officers outside my chain of command. Sir, I absolutely respect your authority to make personnel decisions, Lieutenant Davis replied. However, I also have a professional obligation to speak up when I observe practices that undermine military standards and effectiveness. Discriminatory personnel decisions weaken our forces and waste valuable human resources. Sarah watched this standoff with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Lieutenant Davis had courageously challenged the colonel's discriminatory behavior, but she worried about the potential consequences for both of them. Military hierarchies were rigid structures where challenging superior officers could result in serious career damage, regardless of the moral justification for such actions. Colonel Harrison, perhaps there's a way to resolve this situation that addresses everyone's concerns, Sarah said, speaking for the first time since Lieutenant Davis had entered the conversation. She felt compelled to offer some kind of diplomatic solution that might protect Lieutenant Davis from retaliation while still addressing the fundamental unfairness of her evaluation. Both officers turned toward her with expressions of surprise. She had been largely silent during their confrontation, and her sudden entry into the discussion caught them off guard. Sarah realized that she had an opportunity to influence the outcome of the situation, but she also knew that she needed to proceed carefully to avoid making things worse for everyone involved. Sir, I understand your concerns about ensuring that officers are properly prepared for operational assignments, Sarah continued, addressing Colonel Harrison directly. Perhaps we could discuss specific criteria for demonstrating readiness, and ways that I could prove my capabilities through practical evaluations rather than theoretical discussions. Colonel Harrison looked uncomfortable with this suggestion, probably because it would require him to articulate specific, objective standards for evaluation rather than relying on subjective impressions. Lieutenant Davis, on the other hand, appeared interested in seeing how the colonel would respond to this reasonable proposal. Lieutenant Martinez, the evaluation process is designed to assess readiness based on established protocols, the colonel said, his tone less assertive than before. Additional evaluations aren't typically necessary when initial assessments have been completed. Sir, if the initial assessment raised questions about my readiness, wouldn't it be prudent to conduct more comprehensive evaluations to ensure that personnel decisions are based on complete information? Sarah asked. Military effectiveness depends on having the right people in the right positions, which requires thorough and accurate assessment of individual capabilities. Lieutenant Davis nodded approvingly at Sarah's approach. She was essentially using the colonel's own stated concerns about military effectiveness to argue for more comprehensive evaluation. This tactic put Colonel Harrison in the difficult position of either agreeing to additional assessment or admitting that his initial evaluation was already sufficient despite being based on limited information. The evaluation process is comprehensive and thorough as currently structured, Colonel Harrison insisted, though his tone lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier in the meeting. Additional assessments would be unnecessary and potentially disruptive to normal assignment procedures. Colonel, in special operations, we frequently conduct multiple evaluations to ensure accurate assessment of personnel capabilities, Lieutenant Davis said, providing support for Sarah's suggestion. The stakes are too high to rely on single evaluations, especially when there are questions about the objectivity or completeness of the initial assessment. The room fell silent again as Colonel Harrison struggled to find ways to reject this reasonable proposal without revealing the discriminatory nature of his original assessment. Sarah could see that he was trapped between his desire to maintain his negative evaluation and his inability to provide legitimate justification for refusing more comprehensive assessment. Perhaps Lieutenant Martinez could be assigned to a temporary position where her capabilities could be observed and evaluated in practical situations, Lieutenant Davis suggested. This would provide objective evidence of her leadership potential while allowing for adjustments if necessary. Sarah felt a surge of hope at this proposal. A temporary assignment would give her the opportunity to prove herself through actual performance rather than being dismissed based on unfounded assumptions. It would also provide Colonel Harrison with a face-saving way to modify his assessment without explicitly acknowledging its discriminatory basis. Temporary assignments create administrative complications and resource allocation issues, the colonel said, but his tone suggested he was running out of objections. Personnel assignments are designed to provide stability and clear chains of command. Sir, temporary assignments are common in military operations, especially for new officers who are transitioning from training to operational roles, Lieutenant Davis pointed out. They provide valuable experience while allowing for assessment and adjustment based on actual performance rather than theoretical predictions. Colonel Harrison looked increasingly uncomfortable as his options for maintaining his discriminatory assessment continued to diminish. Sarah could see that Lieutenant Davis's intervention had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the situation, creating pressure for fair treatment that the colonel couldn't easily dismiss or ignore. I'll need to consult with other officers about available temporary positions, Colonel Harrison said reluctantly. Such arrangements require coordination with multiple commands and careful consideration of operational requirements. Sarah realized that this was essentially a capitulation. The colonel was agreeing to explore alternatives to his original negative assessment, which represented a significant victory given where the meeting had seemed to be heading before Lieutenant Davis intervened. She felt a profound gratitude toward the SEAL officer who had risked his own career to ensure fair treatment for someone he had just met. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "I appreciate your willingness to consider additional evaluation opportunities. I'm confident that practical assessment will demonstrate my readiness for operational assignments." Lieutenant Davis smiled slightly at her response, apparently pleased with how she had handled this difficult situation. Sarah realized that his intervention had not only saved her from an unfair assessment, but had also taught her valuable lessons about standing up for principles and challenging discrimination even when it was risky to do so. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing on the deck of the USS Steadfast, a guided missile destroyer conducting training exercises in the Pacific. The temporary assignment that had emerged from her confrontation with Colonel Harrison placed her as an assistant operations officer, responsible for coordinating communications and logistics during the ship's tactical training missions. While not the combat leadership role she had originally hoped for, it represented a significant opportunity to prove her capabilities in a real operational environment. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Torres, had a reputation as one of the Navy's most competent and fair leaders. When Sarah reported aboard, Captain Torres had been direct about the circumstances surrounding her assignment and the need to demonstrate her readiness for permanent operational roles. Unlike Colonel Harrison, Captain Torres seemed genuinely interested in evaluating Sarah's actual performance rather than making assumptions based on her appearance or gender. "Lieutenant Martinez, you'll be working directly with Commander Williams in the Operations Center," Captain Torres had explained during Sarah's initial briefing. "Your responsibilities will include coordinating communications between different departments during tactical exercises, managing logistics information, and assisting with operational planning. These duties will give you exposure to most aspects of shipboard operations while allowing us to assess your decision-making abilities under pressure." The first week aboard the Steadfast had been a whirlwind of learning and adaptation. Sarah quickly discovered that theoretical knowledge from the academy, while valuable, required significant translation to be effective in the fast-paced environment of active naval operations. The ship's crew operated with an efficiency and coordination that impressed her, and she worked diligently to earn their respect through competent performance rather than demanding it based on her rank. Commander Williams, the ship's operations officer, proved to be an excellent mentor who challenged Sarah while providing guidance when needed. Unlike Colonel Harrison, Commander Williams evaluated her performance based on actual results rather than preconceived notions about her capabilities. When she made mistakes, he corrected them constructively. When she demonstrated competence, he acknowledged it fairly. The key to effective operations coordination is maintaining situational awareness while managing multiple information streams simultaneously, Commander Williams explained during one of their planning sessions. "You need to understand not just what's happening, but why it's happening and what it means for our mission objectives." Sarah threw herself into mastering these skills with the same dedication she had applied to her academic studies. She spent extra hours studying ship systems, learning communication protocols, and observing how experienced officers managed complex operational situations. Her goal was to become so competent in her duties that no one could question her readiness for more challenging assignments. The ship's crew initially viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that often greeted new officers, particularly young women in what remained a male-dominated environment. However, Sarah noticed that their attitudes began to shift as she demonstrated reliability and competence in her assigned duties. Respect in military environments was earned through performance, and she was determined to meet that standard. During her second week aboard, the Steadfast was scheduled to participate in a major training exercise involving multiple ships and aircraft. The scenario simulated a complex maritime security operation that would test the crew's ability to coordinate with other units while managing multiple tactical challenges simultaneously. For Sarah, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities in exactly the kind of high-pressure situation that Colonel Harrison had claimed she couldn't handle. The exercise began before dawn, with the ship's general quarters alarm jolting everyone into immediate action. Sarah's station in the operations center placed her at the heart of the ship's information processing and decision-making activities. Multiple communication channels carried reports from various departments, while radar and sonar systems provided continuous updates on the positions of friendly and simulated enemy forces. Lieutenant Martinez, I need you to coordinate communications with the destroyer escort while managing our logistics status reports, Commander Williams directed as the exercise intensified. Air operations are requesting updated fuel consumption projections, and engineering needs to know our expected duration for high-speed operations. Sarah found herself juggling multiple tasks simultaneously, exactly as she had been trained to do, but now with real consequences for the ship's performance in the exercise. She coordinated with different departments, processed information requests, and maintained awareness of the overall tactical situation while ensuring that critical communications weren't delayed or misdirected. As the exercise progressed, the scenario became increasingly complex. Simulated enemy submarines required the ship to modify its course and speed while maintaining coordination with other vessels in the task force. Aircraft operations demanded precise timing for fuel transfers, and potential equipment malfunctions tested the crew's ability to adapt their plans under pressure. We've got a simulated fire in the forward missile compartment, Commander Williams announced. Lieutenant Martinez, coordinate with damage control and provide updated weapon status to the tactical team. We need to know our combat capabilities while emergency procedures are in progress. This was exactly the kind of crisis situation that Sarah had trained for, but never experienced in real operations. She immediately established communication with the damage control teams while pulling up weapons system status on her displays. The simulated emergency required her to balance multiple priorities, supporting the damage control effort while ensuring that tactical operations could continue effectively. Damage control reports the simulated fire is contained, but weapons systems in compartments 3 and 4 are offline for safety procedures, Sarah reported to Commander Williams. Remaining missile systems are fully operational, and I've notified the tactical team of our current weapons status. Excellent work, Lieutenant, Commander Williams replied. Now coordinate with engineering for estimated repair times and update fleet command on our current operational status. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she successfully managed the complex coordination requirements. This was precisely the kind of situation where Colonel Harrison had predicted she would fail, yet she was performing effectively despite the pressure and complexity involved. Her academy training was proving valuable, but more importantly, she was demonstrating the practical leadership abilities that the colonel had claimed she lacked. As the exercise continued into the afternoon, the scenarios became even more challenging. A simulated medical emergency required coordination between multiple ships for medical evacuation procedures. Equipment failures tested the crew's ability to maintain operations with degraded capabilities. Enemy action scenarios demanded rapid tactical responses while maintaining overall mission effectiveness. Throughout these challenges, Sarah found herself growing more confident in her abilities. The theoretical knowledge from her academy training was proving applicable to real situations, and her analytical skills were helping her process complex information quickly and accurately. More importantly, she was earning the respect of the experienced officers and crew members who worked alongside her. Lieutenant Martinez, we're getting reports of a potential collision situation with a civilian vessel, Commander Williams announced during one particularly intense phase of the exercise. I need you to coordinate with navigation, communications, and the bridge to manage this safely while maintaining our exercise participation. This scenario required Sarah to balance competing priorities while managing time-critical safety issues. She immediately established communication with the bridge team while coordinating with navigation to assess the collision risk. Simultaneously, she maintained contact with exercise controllers to report the situation and request guidance on continuing their tactical mission. Bridge reports civilian vessel is responding to our warnings and altering course to maintain safe separation, Sarah reported. Navigation confirms we can maintain exercise parameters while ensuring adequate safety margins. I've notified exercise control of the situation and received approval to continue mission. Outstanding coordination, Lieutenant, Commander Williams said, and Sarah noticed approval in his tone. You manage competing priorities effectively while maintaining safety and mission requirements. The successful resolution of this complex scenario marked a turning point in Sarah's confidence and in the crew's perception of her capabilities. She had demonstrated exactly the kind of practical leadership abilities that military service required, proving that her academy training had adequately prepared her for real operational challenges. As the exercise concluded, Captain Torres visited the operations center to debrief with her staff. Sarah noticed the captain observing her performance during the final phases of the training, and she hoped her contributions had been viewed positively. Overall, excellent performance by the entire operations team, Captain Torres announced. The coordination between departments was smooth, communications were clear and timely, and we successfully managed all assigned scenarios while maintaining safety standards. Captain Torres then addressed Sarah directly. Lieutenant Martinez, your coordination work today was particularly impressive. You demonstrated the kind of multitasking abilities and situational awareness that effective operations officers require. Your performance under pressure was exactly what we need in operational assignments. Sarah felt a profound sense of validation hearing this assessment from an experienced commanding officer. Captain Torres was evaluating her based on actual performance rather than assumptions, and the results vindicated everything Sarah had believed about her own capabilities. After the exercise debriefing concluded, Commander Williams approached Sarah privately. Lieutenant, I wanted to speak with you about your performance during this exercise and over the past 2 weeks in general. Sarah waited attentively, uncertain whether this conversation would bring praise or constructive criticism. Commander Williams had been fair, but demanding throughout her assignment, and she valued his professional opinion highly. Your work has been consistently excellent, Commander Williams continued. You've demonstrated technical competence, leadership potential, and the kind of adaptability that distinguishes effective officers from those who merely meet basic requirements. More importantly, you've earned the respect of the crew through your performance rather than expecting it based on your rank. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. This assignment has been incredibly valuable for developing practical skills and understanding how theoretical training applies to real operations. Lieutenant, I'm going to be completely honest with you, Commander Williams said. When I heard about the circumstances that led to your assignment here, I was skeptical about the whole situation. Temporary assignments often create problems, and I wasn't sure what to expect from an officer who was apparently having qualification issues. Sarah listened carefully, knowing that Commander Williams' assessment would likely influence her future assignments significantly. However, your performance has been exemplary, he continued. I see no evidence of the readiness concerns that were supposedly identified in your initial evaluation. In fact, I've been consistently impressed by your capabilities and your potential for leadership roles. Commander Williams paused, seeming to consider his words carefully before continuing. Lieutenant, I've been in the Navy for 15 years, and I've worked with dozens of junior officers during that time. Your performance ranks among the top tier of officers I've supervised. Whatever concerns were raised about your readiness appear to have been either inaccurate or based on inappropriate criteria. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and vindication hearing this assessment. Commander Williams was essentially confirming what she had believed all along, that Colonel Harrison's negative evaluation had been based on discrimination rather than legitimate professional concerns. Sir, this assignment has been exactly what I needed to bridge the gap between academic training and practical application, Sarah said. I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove my capabilities through actual performance rather than theoretical discussions. Lieutenant, I'm going to be recommending you for permanent assignment to operational roles, Commander Williams said. Based on what I've observed, you're ready for positions with significant responsibility and leadership requirements. I'll be communicating that assessment to the personnel office and to anyone else who asks about your qualifications. As the conversation concluded, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed since that morning in Colonel Harrison's office. Lieutenant Davis's intervention had created the opportunity for fair evaluation, and her performance during this assignment had vindicated his confidence in her abilities. She had proven that gender-based assumptions about military leadership were not only wrong, but potentially harmful to military effectiveness. That evening, as the Steadfast returned to port, Sarah stood on the deck watching the sunset over the Pacific. 2 weeks ago, she had felt defeated and uncertain about her future in the military. Now she felt confident in her abilities and optimistic about the opportunities ahead. The temporary assignment had become a proving ground that demonstrated her readiness for the leadership roles she had always aspired to fill. 6 months after her successful assignment aboard the Steadfast, Sarah found herself preparing for what would become a defining moment in her military career. Commander Williams had been true to his word, recommending her for a permanent position as operations officer aboard the USS Defiant, a state-of-the-art guided missile cruiser scheduled for deployment to the Mediterranean Sea. The assignment represented exactly the kind of challenging operational role she had originally hoped for, complete with significant responsibility for mission planning and tactical coordination. The transition from temporary assignment to permanent operational role had not been without challenges. Sarah had faced continued skepticism from some quarters, and she knew that Colonel Harrison's original assessment still influenced certain personnel decisions. However, the strong recommendations from Captain Torres and Commander Williams had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and she was determined to prove that their confidence in her abilities was justified. The USS Defiant was larger and more complex than the Steadfast, with advanced weapon systems and sophisticated communication equipment that required extensive training to master. As the ship's new operations officer, Sarah would be responsible for coordinating activities between multiple departments while managing communications with other vessels and shore-based commands. The position demanded exactly the kind of multitasking abilities and situational awareness that she had demonstrated during her temporary assignment. Captain James Mitchell, the Defiant's commanding officer, was known throughout the fleet as a demanding but fair leader who expected excellence from his officers. During Sarah's initial briefing, he had been direct about his expectations and the challenges she would face in her new role. Lieutenant Martinez, this ship operates at a high tempo with demanding mission requirements, Captain Mitchell had explained. Your position is critical to our operational effectiveness, and I expect you to be ready for anything. We deploy in 3 weeks, and there won't be time for extensive on-the-job learning once we're operational. Sarah had thrown herself into preparation with characteristic determination, studying ship systems, communication protocols, and operational procedures until she could navigate the ship's complex information networks efficiently. She worked closely with senior enlisted personnel to understand practical aspects of shipboard operations that weren't covered in officer training, earning their respect through genuine interest in learning rather than expecting deference based on her rank. The deployment preparations were intensive and comprehensive. The ship conducted multiple training exercises to ensure readiness for potential combat situations, humanitarian missions, and diplomatic support roles. Sarah's responsibilities during these exercises included coordinating communications between departments, managing logistics information, and supporting tactical planning activities. During one particularly challenging training scenario, the ship's simulated response to a terrorist attack on a Mediterranean port facility. The exercise required coordination between naval forces, air support, and ground-based units while managing complex communications and logistics requirements. Sarah found herself at the center of information flow, ensuring that critical intelligence reached appropriate commanders while coordinating support activities across multiple domains. Lieutenant Martinez, we're receiving reports of additional threats at secondary locations, Captain Mitchell announced during the exercise. I need you to coordinate with intelligence and operations to assess our response capabilities while maintaining support for the primary mission. This scenario tested exactly the kind of complex decision-making abilities that effective military leadership required. Sarah had to process multiple information streams simultaneously while maintaining awareness of overall mission objectives and resource limitations. The exercise demanded rapid analysis and clear communication under pressure, skills she had developed during her academy training, but was now applying in realistic operational contexts. Intelligence reports indicate 3 potential secondary targets, but our current force structure can only address 2 simultaneously, Sarah reported after coordinating with relevant departments. Operations recommends prioritizing targets based on threat assessment and civilian population density. Air support can provide surveillance for the 3rd location until additional resources become available. Excellent analysis, Lieutenant, Captain Mitchell replied. Coordinate with Fleet Command for additional resources while implementing operations recommendations for immediate threats. The successful completion of these training exercises built confidence among the crew and validated the personnel decisions that had placed Sarah in this critical position. Her performance consistently met the high standards that Captain Mitchell demanded, and she was earning recognition as a competent operations officer who could be trusted with significant responsibility. As the deployment date approached, Sarah received an unexpected visit from someone who had played a crucial role in shaping her career trajectory. Lieutenant Davis, the SEAL officer who had intervened during her confrontation with Colonel Harrison, was temporarily assigned to the Defiant for a joint operations training exercise. When he arrived aboard ship, Sarah was surprised by how pleased she felt to see him again. Lieutenant Martinez, it's good to see you again, Lieutenant Davis said when they encountered each other in the ship's passageway. I heard about your assignment here, and wanted to congratulate you on your success. Commander Williams spoke very highly of your performance aboard the Steadfast. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude as she remembered how Lieutenant Davis had risked his own career to ensure fair treatment during her evaluation. Without his intervention, she might still be relegated to administrative duties rather than preparing for operational deployment in a position that utilized her training and abilities. Lieutenant Davis, it's wonderful to see you, Sarah replied. I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for what you did in Colonel Harrison's office. Your willingness to speak up changed the entire trajectory of my career. Lieutenant, you don't owe me anything, Lieutenant Davis responded with a slight smile. What I did was simply fulfill my obligation as an officer to ensure fair treatment and proper utilization of personnel. The credit for your success belongs entirely to you and your demonstrated capabilities. They walked together toward the operations center, where Lieutenant Davis would be briefed on the joint training exercise that had brought him aboard the Defiant. Sarah found herself curious about his perspective on the events that had led to her current assignment and his thoughts on the broader issues surrounding gender discrimination in military personnel decisions. Can I ask what motivated you to intervene that day? Sarah said as they paused outside the operations center. You had no personal investment in my situation, and challenging a senior officer's assessment carried real risks for your career. Lieutenant Davis considered the question for a moment before responding. Lieutenant, military effectiveness depends on having the best people in the right positions, regardless of their background or personal characteristics. When I see personnel decisions being made based on discrimination rather than merit, it weakens our forces and wastes valuable human resources. He paused, seemingly reflecting on his own experiences before continuing. I've worked with outstanding officers from all backgrounds throughout my career. Some of the most effective leaders I've served with were people who faced initial skepticism based on assumptions about their capabilities. Combat doesn't care about gender, race, or social background. It only cares about competence, courage, and leadership ability. Sarah appreciated his thoughtful response and the principled approach he had taken to a difficult situation. It reinforced her belief that military service at its best represented values of fairness, merit-based advancement, and mutual respect among personnel who shared common goals and commitments. Your intervention gave me the opportunity to prove my capabilities through performance rather than being dismissed based on assumptions, Sarah said. That opportunity made all the difference in my career prospects. Lieutenant, based on everything I've heard about your performance since then, I'm confident you would have found ways to succeed regardless, Lieutenant Davis replied. Talent and determination usually find ways to emerge, though it shouldn't require overcoming discriminatory barriers. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Mitchell, who was preparing for the joint training exercise briefing. Sarah introduced Lieutenant Davis to the captain, and they proceeded into the operations center where senior officers were gathering for planning sessions. The joint training exercise would simulate a complex maritime security operation involving multiple ships, aircraft, and special operations forces. Lieutenant Davis's role would involve coordinating between naval units and special operations teams conducting hypothetical reconnaissance and direct action missions. For Sarah, the exercise represented an opportunity to demonstrate her coordination abilities in the most challenging operational scenarios. This exercise will test our ability to integrate different types of forces while maintaining operational security and mission effectiveness, Captain Mitchell explained during the initial briefing. Lieutenant Martinez will coordinate communications and logistics between naval units and special operations forces, ensuring that all elements have the information and support they need to accomplish their objectives. The exercise began 2 days later with complex scenarios that required precise coordination between different military specialties. Sarah found herself managing communications between the ship's tactical team, aircraft controllers, and special operations units conducting simulated missions. The integration of these diverse capabilities demanded exactly the kind of analytical thinking and communication skills she had developed throughout her training. Special Operations Team reports successful insertion at Objective Alpha, Sarah announced during one phase of the exercise. They're requesting naval gunfire support for extraction phase, beginning at coordinates Delta 79. Air support is standing by for close air support, if needed. Roger, coordinate with weapons control for naval gunfire support, Captain Mitchell directed. Ensure special operations frequency is monitored for real-time target adjustments. The successful coordination of these complex operations reinforced Sarah's confidence in her abilities while demonstrating her value to the ship's operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Davis, observing from his position coordinating special operations elements, could see how her skills contributed to mission success. As the exercise concluded, Captain Mitchell gathered his senior officers for debriefing sessions that would evaluate performance and identify areas for improvement. Sarah had consistently performed well throughout the scenarios, managing complex coordination requirements while maintaining situational awareness and supporting tactical decision-making. Lieutenant Martinez, your coordination work during this exercise was exemplary, Captain Mitchell said during the operations debriefing. You successfully integrated naval and special operations elements while maintaining clear communications and effective logistics support. This kind of performance gives me confidence in our readiness for deployment. After the formal debriefing concluded, Lieutenant Davis approached Sarah privately to offer his assessment of her performance during the exercise. His perspective as an experienced special operations officer provided valuable insight into her effectiveness in joint operation scenarios. Lieutenant, your coordination work made a significant difference in mission success, Lieutenant Davis said. From a special operations perspective, you provided exactly the kind of support that effective joint operations require. Your communication was clear and timely, and you anticipated our needs rather than simply reacting to requests. Sarah felt deeply gratified by this assessment from an officer whose judgment she respected highly. Lieutenant Davis had seen her performance in the most challenging operational scenarios, and his positive evaluation validated her readiness for the deployment ahead. Thank you, Lieutenant Davis, Sarah replied. Working with Special Operations Forces taught me a lot about coordination requirements and the importance of maintaining situational awareness across different operational domains. Lieutenant, I want you to know that your success reflects well on all of us, Lieutenant Davis said. Every time someone overcomes discriminatory barriers and proves their capabilities through performance, it makes the entire military stronger and more effective. As Lieutenant Davis prepared to depart the ship and return to his regular assignment, Sarah reflected on how his intervention had created opportunities that were now allowing her to fulfill her potential as a military officer. The temporary assignment he had helped arrange had led to permanent placement in exactly the kind of challenging operational role she had always aspired to fill. The deployment was scheduled to begin within days, and Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges it might bring. Her preparation had been thorough, her performance during training exercises had been consistently strong, and she had earned the confidence of senior officers who would rely on her abilities during operational missions. As she stood on the ship's deck watching the sun set over the harbor, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. Colonel Harrison's discriminatory assessment had nearly derailed her career before it truly began, but Lieutenant Davis's intervention and her own determination had created opportunities to prove her capabilities through performance rather than assumptions. The deployment ahead would present new challenges and opportunities to further demonstrate her readiness for increased responsibility and leadership roles. Sarah felt confident that her training, experience, and proven track record had prepared her for whatever missions the Mediterranean deployment might bring. 2 years had passed since the USS Defiant's successful Mediterranean deployment, and Sarah Martinez now stood in the same administrative building where her military career had nearly been derailed by Colonel Harrison's discriminatory assessment. However, this time she wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander and carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from proven battlefield leadership. She had been promoted ahead of her peers and was now preparing to take command of her own ship, a rare achievement for an officer of her age and experience level. The deployment aboard the Defiant had proven to be everything Sarah had hoped for and more. During 6 months of operations in the Mediterranean, the ship had participated in multinational exercises, humanitarian missions, and counterterrorism operations that tested every aspect of her skills as an operations officer. Her performance had been consistently outstanding, earning recognition from fleet commanders and establishing her reputation as one of the Navy's rising stars. The transformation in her professional standing had been remarkable. Officers who had once viewed her with skepticism now sought her input on complex operational questions. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into fleet-wide training procedures, and her leadership style had become a model for effective integration of diverse personnel capabilities. The discrimination she had faced early in her career now seemed like a distant memory, though it had taught her valuable lessons about persistence and the importance of principled leadership. Captain Mitchell had become one of her strongest advocates, consistently recommending her for challenging assignments and increased responsibility. Under his mentorship, Sarah had developed into exactly the kind of versatile, competent officer that the modern Navy required. When the opportunity arose for early promotion and ship command, he had personally endorsed her candidacy despite the unusual timeline. Lieutenant Commander Martinez represents the future of naval leadership, Captain Mitchell had written in his recommendation. Her tactical acumen, operational competence, and inspirational leadership style make her an ideal candidate for increased responsibility. She has consistently demonstrated the ability to excel in complex, high-pressure situations while maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. Now Sarah was returning to the same facility where her career had almost ended before it truly began, but this time she was there to attend the Naval Leadership Excellence Award ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Davis, recently promoted and recognized for his outstanding service in multiple special operations campaigns, was receiving the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for his role in a classified counterterrorism operation. Sarah had been invited to attend as his guest, an honor that reflected their ongoing professional relationship and mutual respect. The ceremony was being held in the building's main auditorium, a grand space that had hosted numerous military events throughout its history. Senior officers from across the fleet had gathered to recognize outstanding achievements in leadership, innovation, and service. For Sarah, attending the ceremony represented a full-circle moment that highlighted how dramatically her circumstances had changed since that difficult morning in Colonel Harrison's office. As she walked through the building's corridors, Sarah encountered several officers she had worked with during her early career. Their interactions now reflected the respect she had earned through consistent high performance and proven leadership abilities. The young woman who had once faced skeptical questions about her readiness for military service was now recognized as one of the Navy's most promising future leaders. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, congratulations on your upcoming command assignment, said Captain Thompson, the base commander who had overseen many of her performance evaluations. Your promotion timeline is exceptional, and the fleet is fortunate to have officers of your caliber in leadership positions. Sarah thanked Captain Thompson for his recognition, while reflecting on how different these interactions felt compared to her early experiences as a junior officer. Respect in military environments was still earned through performance, but now her track record spoke for itself rather than requiring constant validation. The auditorium was filling with distinguished guests as Sarah found her seat near the front of the ceremony area. She spotted several familiar faces among the attendees, including Commander Williams, who had provided crucial mentorship during her assignment aboard the Steadfast. He waved when he saw her, and she could see the pride in his expression as he observed how far she had progressed in her career. As the ceremony began, Sarah found herself thinking about Lieutenant Commander Davis and the courage he had shown in challenging Colonel Harrison's discriminatory assessment. His intervention had created the opportunity for fair evaluation that ultimately allowed her to prove her capabilities through performance. Without his willingness to risk his own career for the sake of principle, her military service might have taken a very different trajectory. The citation for Lieutenant Commander Davis's Distinguished Service Medal described his leadership during a complex joint operation that had successfully disrupted terrorist activities in a politically sensitive region. The details were classified, but the recognition highlighted his exceptional ability to coordinate between different military services while achieving mission objectives under challenging conditions. For Sarah, it represented validation of the character and competence she had observed during their first encounter. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Davis, United States Navy, is awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service in a duty of great responsibility, the Admiral announced as Davis stepped forward to receive his medal. His outstanding leadership, tactical expertise, and unwavering commitment to mission success reflect great credit upon himself, the United States Navy, and the United States Naval Service. As Davis received his medal and the associated recognition, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the role he had played in her career development. The ceremony provided an opportunity to reflect on how individual acts of courage and principle could have far-reaching effects on other people's lives and careers. After the formal ceremony concluded, there was a reception where attendees could congratulate the award recipients and socialize with colleagues from across the fleet. Sarah approached Lieutenant Commander Davis to offer her congratulations and express her continued appreciation for his support during her early career challenges. "Marcus, congratulations on this well-deserved recognition," Sarah said, using his first name now that their professional relationship had evolved into a friendship based on mutual respect. "Your service record continues to exemplify the highest standards of military excellence." "Sarah, thank you for being here," Davis replied with genuine warmth. "Seeing your success makes this ceremony even more meaningful. Your promotion and command assignment represent exactly the kind of outcome that fair personnel practices should produce." They moved to a quieter area of the reception where they could speak more privately about their experiences and perspectives on military leadership. Both had achieved significant career milestones, but they remained mindful of the challenges that other officers might face in overcoming discriminatory barriers. "I've been following your career progression with great interest," Davis continued. "Your performance during deployment and your innovative approaches to tactical coordination have earned recognition throughout the fleet. You've become exactly the kind of leader the Navy needs for its future challenges." Sarah appreciated his continued support and was curious about his perspective on the broader changes occurring within military culture. The Navy had implemented several policy reforms aimed at ensuring fair treatment and advancement opportunities for all personnel, partly in response to documented cases of discrimination similar to what she had experienced. "The military is slowly becoming more effective at recognizing and utilizing talent regardless of an individual's background," Sarah observed. "Your willingness to challenge discriminatory practices that day played a role in creating opportunities for fair evaluation that benefit everyone." "Sarah, your success demonstrates what happens when personnel decisions are based on merit rather than assumptions," Davis replied. "Every time someone overcomes discriminatory barriers and proves their capabilities, it helps create a culture where talent is properly recognized and developed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Sarah Chun, the fleet commander who had personally endorsed Sarah's early promotion to lieutenant commander. Admiral Chun was one of the Navy's most senior female officers and had herself overcome significant challenges during her rise through the ranks. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez, I wanted to congratulate you personally on your upcoming command assignment," Admiral Chun said. "Your promotion timeline reflects exceptional performance and leadership potential. The Navy needs more officers who can adapt to complex operational environments while maintaining the highest standards of excellence." Sarah felt honored by Admiral Chen's recognition and was curious about her perspective on the progress being made in creating equal opportunities for all military personnel. Admiral Chen had experienced the military during an era when discrimination was more overt and systemic, making her insights particularly valuable. Admiral, I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had to prove my capabilities through operational performance, Sarah said. The mentorship and support I've received from officers like Lieutenant Commander Davis and others have been crucial to my development as a leader. Lieutenant Commander, your success story demonstrates the importance of having advocates who are willing to speak up for fair treatment and proper utilization of talent, Admiral Chen replied. Military effectiveness depends on creating environments where all personnel can contribute their full potential. The conversation continued with discussions about leadership challenges, operational innovations, and the importance of creating inclusive cultures that maximize organizational effectiveness. For Sarah, interacting with senior officers like Admiral Chen provided valuable perspective on her own experiences and the broader context of military service. As the reception continued, Sarah encountered Colonel Harrison for the first time since their confrontational meeting 2 years earlier. The encounter was unexpected and potentially awkward, given the history of their interaction and the dramatic change in her career trajectory since that time. She approached the situation with professional composure, curious about how he would react to her obvious success. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, Colonel Harrison said when he noticed her, his tone carefully neutral. I understand congratulations are in order for your recent promotion and command assignment. Sarah could detect discomfort in his demeanor, and she suspected that her success had forced him to reconsider his initial assessment of her capabilities. The professional recognition she had achieved made it difficult to maintain the dismissive attitude he had displayed during their original encounter. Thank you, Colonel, Sarah replied with professional courtesy. I've been fortunate to serve with outstanding officers who provided excellent mentorship and opportunities for growth. Colonel Harrison appeared to struggle with how to respond to her diplomatic approach. Sarah's success had essentially proven that his discriminatory assessment had been completely wrong, and her gracious response highlighted the professional maturity she had developed during her subsequent service. Your operational performance has been impressive, the colonel said somewhat reluctantly. It's clear that your capabilities were perhaps not fully apparent during our initial evaluation. Sarah recognized this as the closest thing to an acknowledgement of error that she was likely to receive from Colonel Harrison. While it fell short of a direct apology, it at least represented recognition that his original assessment had been incorrect. She decided to respond in a way that focused on positive outcomes rather than revisiting past grievances. Military service provides many opportunities for growth and development, Sarah said diplomatically. I'm grateful for all the experiences that have contributed to my professional development, including the challenges that helped me become a stronger officer. The brief interaction concluded with mutual professional courtesy, but Sarah could sense that Colonel Harrison understood the broader implications of their encounter. Her success stood as a clear refutation of the discriminatory assumptions that had nearly derailed her career, demonstrating the importance of fair evaluation processes and merit-based personnel decisions. As the evening concluded, Sarah and Lieutenant Commander Davis found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them both to this point of professional recognition and career success. The ceremony had provided an opportunity to celebrate achievements while acknowledging the importance of principled leadership and mutual support. Sarah, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished, Davis said as they prepared to leave the reception. Your success validates the importance of fighting for fair treatment and proper recognition of talent. You've become an inspiration for other officers who face similar challenges. Marcus, I'll always be grateful for your courage in speaking up when it mattered most, Sarah replied. Your intervention created the opportunity for me to prove my capabilities through performance rather than being dismissed based on assumptions. That opportunity changed everything. As they walked out of the building together, Sarah looked back at the facility where her career had nearly ended before it truly began. The contrast between that difficult morning and this evening of celebration highlighted how dramatically circumstances could change when principled people were willing to stand up for what was right. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez now commanded respect throughout the fleet based on proven performance and demonstrated leadership capabilities. Her upcoming ship command represented the fulfillment of dreams that had once seemed impossible, achieved through persistence, competence, and the support of colleagues who believed in fair treatment for all military personnel. The discrimination she had faced early in her career had taught valuable lessons about the importance of creating inclusive cultures where talent could flourish regardless of personal characteristics. Her success story would inspire other officers facing similar challenges while contributing to broader cultural changes that strengthen military effectiveness. As she drove home that evening, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey that had transformed her from a young officer facing discriminatory barriers into a recognized leader preparing for significant command responsibility. The path had not always been easy, but it had ultimately led to achievements that exceeded her original aspirations and demonstrated the importance of never giving up on principled goals.